I mean, the idea that the surge has been effective is chronologically wrong. It's so clear what happened. If you look at the pattern, there's really no excuse for this becoming an entrenched piece of conventional wisdom. There's no excuse. Anybody can see what happened. You know, we started putting tens of thousands of people who had formerly called insurgents on the U.S. payroll. We started paying them $300 a month not to shoot at us. We surrendered large swaths of territory. We've just handed over Anbar province a month ago. This didn't even it barely made the media. It barely made the news. We handed that over to whom? Well, to the same people that we classified as the worst of the worst and terrorists and Islamic militants and all of that. So, I mean, the idea that the surge has worked is ludicrous. And yes, a great deal of the reason that violence has decreased is that some neighborhoods that were mixed were ultimately cleansed. But I would even go so far as to say that one thing that, you know, I'm cautious to talk about these things because the reality is that most Iraqis identify themselves as Iraqis. Most Iraqis don't identify themselves as Sunni and Shia. And we've gotten this idea, and it's very, very pervasive in our society, that if we were to pull out, these people would start killing each other in massive wholesale slaughter. That's based on nothing. That's based on the war supporters, the people who got us into this conflict, trying to figure out a premise to keep us there. And we've written stories that I would urge you to go into alternet.org and search for Riyad Jarrar's name because I'm all over the place. And we've got stories about local domestic attempts to do reconciliation projects, to bring these different conflicted parties together that the United States has crushed. We've stopped peacemaking efforts in Iraq. We've stopped them.
Josh, one more, and this kind of piggybacks on what you were saying, but the story that I wrote didn't get covered for a very different reason than the stories that you're talking about.
Right.
And you kind of touched on this, but there is, particularly in foreign policy, there's the village culture, the tribalism, the kind of tribalism, is much more systematic. And it's not censorship, but what it is, O'Hanlon gets to be a pro, gets to be somebody who gets quoted because I mean, and you go back to the New York Times story about the generals who were doing the stories that Rummy wanted.
Right.
It is very systematic that only the people who say what they want to say are allowed to tell the story. And I thought I'd be interested to hear you talk about that because it goes back to a lot of some of the issues, but it really is more formal than what I was talking about.
Well, there's a few things. I mean, that's an exceptional program. Yes, that is certainly a concentrated and systematic disinformation campaign. If you don't know what Marcy was referring to, it was this whole program to get generals who would basically tout the party line into the media. A successful program that all the media is very defensive about ever since it was broken in the Times. But you know, I think that when it comes to foreign policy, you're dealing with a few things that make it all much more difficult. First of all, it's out of sight, out of mind. These are things that go on far away. So you don't have this check of domestic policy considerations. People don't consider their interests intimately tied with foreign policy decisions. Another problem is that, you know, all foreign policy is an extension of domestic politics. This is it's axiomatic in foreign policy analysis. So these things get caught up in the debate, the partisan debates, and that becomes a vehicle for discussing foreign policy, which is wrong. I mean, you know, these things are not Democratic or Republican issues necessarily, but they get swallowed up and subsumed in those things, and that keeps us from having a real critical discussion of these things in the media. And then the final thing, which is really deep, is American exceptionalism. And this is something that goes, you know, across the political spectrum and is very, very, it's a basic tenet of foreign policy discussion in the mainstream media. So, I mean, I think that this is of course there are those kinds of overt attempts and successful overt attempts to steer the discourse on foreign policy, but again, almost more pervasive than that are just the kind of assumptions that are shared by everybody in the foreign policy establishment. And I went to one of the elite foreign policy schools, and I really saw it there. These are the future foreign policy makers that I went and studied with, and there was a significant amount of debate at the margins, but not at the core of the U.S. foreign policy assumptions, and not just the U.S. by the way. These are things that go back 2,400 years. I mean, you can go and read about the Peloponnesian Wars, and it's very, very similar to what's going on today. Hi.
Hi. During the 90s, over 500,000 children died because of the UN sanctions. Did they make note of the ages of those who have died since 2004?
Yes. And you'll have to go to the study. The Lancet has it divided by age. And that 500,000 is such an estimate. These are the 500,000 children under 5 estimated to have died as a result of malnutrition and lack of access to drugs during the sanctions period. This was what gave rise to the UN Oil for Food program, which actually was one of the most successful UN programs ever.
And I would like your general opinion, considering what happened in the 90s, and I wouldn't be surprised if a large amount of those who died were also children. What do you think that's going to do to the next generation for Iraq?
Well, I mean, the reality is that you can't liberate people by bombing their cities, and it's a self-defeating idea in the first place. So what we're doing is we're creating an enormous groundswell of people who hate us to the point where they may become real enemies and really want to do us harm. There have been, for some time now, the Project on International Policy Attitudes at the University of Maryland has polled Iraqis. And it's remarkable the number of Iraqis who approve of attacks on U.S. troops. This has ranged from, it was at a low point of about 40%, and it's well over 60% today. There's only one opinion poll, and I'm very interested in Iraqi opinion. There's only one opinion poll that I'm aware of. It was done by PIPA in 2004 that explicitly asked, how do you view U.S. troops? And it gave 3 choices. You could say they are liberators, peacekeepers, or occupiers. And 92% of Iraqis thought that we were occupiers. And this tells you a lot about what's going on, the dynamics of the conflict there. This is another FOD fact. I mean, it's very, very rarely reported. Generally, the kind of the going narrative is that we're supported by the majority and opposed by extremists, and that's really not the way it is. And if you think about it, this has real policy ramifications, because this idea that we can keep a force in Iraq in this Disneyfied green zone indefinitely and have the violence ebb somehow is really contrary to all of our experience with insurgencies. I mean, basically, you do need, in order to mount an effective insurgency, you need the support from at least some element within the community, and they have it. Anyone else?